that motion be agreed. The Honourable Alison Xamon.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. I want to begin my valedictory by paying my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting, the Whadjuk-Noongar people, and I reflect on the positive decision which was made in this place during this term to ensure that this acknowledgement of country is automatically included every day when we open our proceedings. It was a change that wasn't made before time, and it's a sombre reflection, I think, that in 2021 that we still have so very far to go in terms of achieving justice and reconciliation with the First Nations people of this land. I want to share my gratitude with those First Nations people who, over the 2 terms that I've been in this place, have worked with and guided me in trying to address so many of those issues that continue to remain unaddressed for our Aboriginal people, the failure of which too often results in tragic consequences. The record number of incarcerations, including of First Nations children in our prisons, and the shocking number of resultant deaths in custody. The fact that we still have a horrendous gap in life expectancy for First Nations people compared with other Australians, disproportionate levels of homelessness and of poverty, and of children taken into care, the number of Aboriginal people still denied appropriate disability supports, and the lack of mental health services so desperately needed to address the effects of intergenerational trauma and the devastatingly high rates of First Nations suicides. It's my fervent hope that I will see these injustices addressed in my lifetime and that we will finally achieve treaty. Now, it would have been my preference not to be giving a valedictory speech at this time. It had been my hope that I would be able to give it in 4 years' time, although as a Green I've always gone into every election with my eyes open as to the fact that electoral success is in no way guaranteed. And on that note, it's simultaneously galling yet strangely gratifying to find specifically the loss of my seat, the Green in North Metro, being held out in the media and even by this government as an example of our broken electoral system. And, of course, it is broken, a fact from which I've never resiled. There are indeed people in this chamber who will be continuing their terms who achieved far lower votes than I, and people entering this chamber with embarrassingly low primaries. I am pleased that I achieved the highest Green vote, but this is the system we have, a system that I have attempted to address, albeit unsuccessfully, but more on that in a moment. But the one thing I can confirm is that no Green worth their salt enters this parliament with the idea that they'll be carving out a permanent career as a politician, partly because I don't think it's something positive for any Green to aspire to, partly because of the vicariousness of the electoral system, as I've just said, but also because of the nature of being a progressive party. By definition, to be a progressive party means to be consistently at the forefront of pushing for necessary change. The Greens are not a middle-of-the-road party. We don't sit comfortably with the centrist status quo. Parties of the status quo are the parties that become the party of government. Instead, the Greens are a party that's always seeking to do things better, to seek progress, to make the world a better place, because we recognise that it needs to be. It means that at any given time we find ourselves challenging majority views, whether it would be recognising the science of climate change when the majority remained in denial, pushing for equal marriage when the majority claimed that the very fabric of society will collapse if we allowed people who love each other to enter into lifelong union, or currently calling for the banning of greyhound racing, which will eventually happen, by the way. We just don't know how many dogs will suffer and die until we do. Just to mention 3 very diverse examples. Every time the Greens push for progressive, albeit necessary reform, we find ourselves derided, dismissed and even ridiculed, and yet without fail, whether it be 5 or 10 or 15 years later, the majority end up adopting our positions, even claiming it as their own in a convenient reinvention of history. Now, I could choose to be frustrated by that, or I could choose to feel how I do, which is pleased that the work that I do in the end makes a difference, a positive difference, even if at the time I may not see the immediate rewards or even get the recognition for having done the hard yards. My favourite saying is that the arc of history is long, but it leans towards justice. And that is how I view the work that I've done, and I'll continue to do over the decades of my life, this one very precious life that I get. I feel that I'm on the right side of history, and the Greens are the party that's leading that. So it means that at any given time, the Greens are not going to receive the majority vote, even when the majority do end up agreeing with us years later. So as a Greens MP, I've been committed to making the most of the precious and the limited time that I get in Parliament. And members, I believe I have made the most of my time here. One of only 36 people in Western Australia at any given time that get a chance to use the forum that is the Legislative Council. And I've had the hefty workload to match this intent. Now, in my first term, and as the member for the East Metropolitan Region, I was the Greens spokesperson for water, urban bushland, mental health, disability, children and youth, women, the public service, the community sector, electoral affairs, vet affairs, volunteering, education and training. I sat on the Legislation Committee. In conjunction with the ALP and the Nationals, we killed off the proposed stop and search laws. I note that the ALP are toying with the idea of reintroducing something similar now that they're in government. In my second term, I was the Greens spokesperson for alcohol and other drugs, animal welfare, child protection, community services, consumer protection, corrective services, disability, education, electoral affairs, family and domestic violence, gambling, health, homelessness, industrial relations and worker safety, integrity of government, law and order, mental health, multicultural affairs, public sector, seniors and ageing, sexuality and gender diversity, suicide prevention, training and workforce development, veterans affairs, volunteering, women and youth. As people know, I also took on the role of parliamentary leader, more akin to a whip, as we practice facilitative, not directive leadership. It's a good model. And I sat on the Joint Standing Committee oversighting the Corruption and Crime Commission, a role I absolutely took on in good faith, but not a role for the faint-hearted. Was periodically co-opted onto the Procedure and Privileges Committee, was Deputy Chair of the Select Committee Inquiry into Elder Abuse, which produced an excellent report, by the way, sat on the Select Committee into Palliative Care, and of greatest importance to me, chaired the Select Committee into Alternative Approaches to Addressing Illicit Drug Use. I'm very proud of the report that final committee produced, and thanks again to those most excellent of committee members. Mark my words, that work is going to stand the test of time, and I urge members who are continuing in this place to ensure that that resource is utilised. We purport to follow the public health advice when dealing with a pandemic, so let's do the same to reduce the harm of illicit drugs to the community and to individuals and to their families. This last term, I was also pleased to co-chair Parliamentary Friends groups, the Parliamentary Friends of Children, which I co-chaired with the Honourable Donna Farragut, Lisa Baker, the member for Maylands, and the now Leader of the Opposition, Mia Davies. And I was particularly pleased to co-chair the Parliamentary Friends of Refugees, with the former member for Mirrabooka, Janine Freeman, bringing the lived experience of refugees and asylum seekers directly into this place. Now, I had been looking forward to establishing the Parliamentary Friends of the Senses with Honourable Martin Pritchard, combining his interest in working with the deaf community with my passion for working with the blind and vision impaired. And I'd also been looking forward to establishing the Parliamentary Friends of Research into Rare Diseases with the Honourable Matt Swinburne, for whom, like me, the issue is deeply personal. I'm disappointed that I won't be able to proceed with that. It has been fun hosting events up here at Parliament and helping to turn it very practically into the People's House. Pride at Parliament's always a big deal and a great joy, although hosting the guide dogs up here and giving Guide Dogs WA the opportunity to corner the Premier and present their proposed business case was a distinct highlight. Also knowing that I could assist numerous groups, Aboriginal groups, mental health, disability and justice reform groups, environmental groups to access Parliament and to meet with interested MPs on issues of importance always felt like a distinct privilege and an opportunity. Now, I've been a member in this place for 8 years, but in that time I've introduced several private members' bills, motions and given countless speeches, as members are well aware, and for which I make absolutely no apology. I've scrutinised countless bills, amended many and asked literally thousands of questions. A simple perusal of Hansard demonstrates that I've done more work than many who end up in this place, even for far longer periods of time than I. I know that the ALP government have found me to be a thorn in their side, and I remind them that the previous Liberal National government felt the same way when I attempted to hold them to account as well. The Greens aren't beholden to either side of Parliament. We have our own important agenda to pursue, we've got stakeholders to represent and a future to fight for. So as I say, over the course of 8 years, I've introduced many bills. I inherited 2 bills from Greens' predecessors, the Perth Hills Planning Bill 2010 from the Honourable Giz Watson, which sought to establish a planning regime over our unique Perth Hills, which would have protected precious ecosystems. I worked on that in conjunction with the group Save Perth Hills for 4 years. I note that a decade later, the Perth Hills residents are still fighting to save the Perth Hills from inappropriate and overdevelopments. I also inherited the Water Services Licensing Water Conservation Target Amendment Bill from the Honourable Paul Llewellyn, which would have ensured that targets for water conservation were enshrined by statute. As climate change becomes more entrenched, who knows how helpful that bill would have proven to be. I introduced the Occupational Safety and Health Amendment Bill 2010, which sought to introduce tougher penalties and responses to OSH breaches, and it was this bill which also introduced the offence of industrial manslaughter. At the time, I note, I was ridiculed and I was condemned by members from both sides of the chamber, I might add, as well as by industry bodies who felt that it would be too great a burden if they didn't have the flexibility to kill their workers. Industrial manslaughter laws were a gross overreaction to a workplace death, I was told. Nevertheless, when I was re-elected, I reintroduced the industrial manslaughter provisions in the form of the Criminal Code Amendment Industrial Manslaughter Bill 2017. I knew that harsh penalties for those willing to put profit above workers' lives was no overreaction, and I'm pleased at this time that the response was different. This time, the issue received the support it was due, and the government introduced its own bill. Too many people had died in the time from when I had first introduced it, but at least finally it had had its day. I put that down to a victory for progressive politics, and personally it felt like important enclosure for me, as a former union official scarred with seeing the fallout of families devastated by completely avoidable workplace deaths with no justice forthcoming. The issue of the gender pay gap, of which WA consistently is one of the worst performers, has burdened women for years. In response to this, in 2011, I introduced the Industrial Relations Equal Remuneration Amendment Bill 2011, which would have enabled pay equity cases to be heard within the WA IRC. Once again, with the issue still very much unresolved, I reintroduced the bill again in 2010. To date, pay equity cases still can't be heard, although undertakings have finally been given that a future bill to amend the Industrial Relations Act will finally include such a provision. Small victories, and I hope that it happens. The Criminal Code Amendment Bill No. 2, 2011, sought to introduce a defence to mandatory sentencing for assault on a public officer where it could be demonstrated that a person was floridly psychotic at the time of committing an offence. In other words, too mentally unwell to even know what they were doing. Clearly, prison is not the appropriate place for such unwell people. My bill wasn't supported, but in response, prosecutorial guidelines were introduced ostensibly to avoid such an unjust scenario. So it's sad to continue to hear that despite undertakings to the contrary, that these guidelines periodically continue to be ignored and that we continue to simply lock up people who need medical help, not prison. My bill, I think, would have been a better solution to this problem. The Equal Opportunity LGBTIQ Anti-Discrimination Amendment Bill 2018 sought to finally remove a number of religious exemptions from the Act, exemptions which still allow teachers to be sacked and children to be expelled for being LGBTIQ. Other states have already undertaken these reforms, in some instances over 2 decades ago, but we here in WA have not had the political gumption to address this. Once again, I know that history will be on my side, but I'm sad for those within our community whose rights will continue to be traversed until we get there, and I thank those many churches who indicated their support for such changes. By no means do all churches want these laws retained. I'm particularly adamant about the need for reforms along the lines of my electoral amendment Access to Ministers Bill, first introduced in 2012 and then again in 2017. Paying for access to ministers simply should not be allowed, and I only hope that one day it will become illegal. I think the average punter finds it unbelievable that such practices can legally continue. I have wryly observed the fallout following this election and the outrage about the need to reform ticket voting. Well, people, this is where I remind the government that the electoral amendment, ticket voting and associated reforms Bill 2019 had been sitting there for 18 months. It could have been passed at any time before the election. Now, it looks like it might actually come to pass now, and I'm wondering, do I chalk that up as another win? It's too late for those who lost their seats due to the ticket rorting, but maybe post-2025 it will finally be addressed. Finally, I want to mention a bill I drafted in my first term, but that I attempted to garner support for from the Barnett government of the day, but that ended up not being introduced, and that was my party status bill. It had long been a source of disquiet that a political party could only receive party status if it had a minimum of 5 elected members in the Legislative Assembly. This has historically been a problem for the Greens who, whilst having had representation in the Assembly in the past, have historically achieved the minimum 5 representatives primarily through our representation in the Council. Such is the nature of parties whose support is spread throughout Western Australia rather than limited to smaller locationally based populations. We are still the 3rd largest party by overall vote. I did garner in-principle support from the leader of the Nationals at the time, but it never progressed beyond the Premier, who was disinterested. I reflect now on the challenges that both the Liberal and the National parties have faced following this election, where the arbitrary focus on the Assembly as opposed to entire state representation has posed such a challenge in gaining party status. My point is, evidence from Western democracies around the world show that elections are becoming more volatile, not less, and electoral success comes in swings and roundabouts. The Greens have always understood this. I hope that this ALP government also has the humility to keep this in mind, because the electoral tsunamis have the potential to go both ways. Now, in my first term, as I mentioned, amongst my many portfolios, I held the water portfolio, and this constituted a huge amount of my work, from endless work on what was happening with the Nangara Mound, pushing for improved licensing and monitoring and sustainable extraction regimes. The health of the Swan River was a big focus, our drainage systems, nutrient loads, dolphin health, and what was then the emerging industry of fracking within WA. My office became ground zero for the campaign to try to get the detail around what was being proposed and the woefully inadequate regulations surrounding the industry. I had a motion calling for a moratorium on coal seam gas extraction, which was opposed by both sides. Again, the Greens led the charge, and I just copped the flak at the time, and I did get a fair bit of it. I also had motions that called for better regulation of the insidious uranium industry and genuine protection of our bush forever sites. And there's no question that one of my principal passions remained around the need for improved mental health and suicide prevention services. Now, I've been very public about my family's, indeed my own personal history on this, about the life-defining, tragic impact that my father's decision to take his life has had on my life. We all bring our personal experiences to some degree to this place and to our work, and I'm glad that out of something truly terrible, that hopefully my own lived experience helped to bring a voice to this chamber for so many others. I've always wondered whether my dad would have been proud that I became a Member of Parliament, and I will never know. Early on, I called for the establishment of a mental health court, which we now have. I've consistently called for regulation of the mental health sector, counsellors, psychotherapists, social workers. People should simply not be allowed to hold themselves out as mental health professionals without oversight and regulation. I went down the rabbit hole of calling for reform of the way that we deal with those vulnerable people who are mentally impaired accused. The case of Marlon Noble was instrumental in leading me there, and from that I continued to meet more and more families who had loved ones with various cognitive and intellectual impairments who were continually failed by the justice system. I note that even members in this place from other parties, and including government members, over the course of the past term would refer these families through to my office for assistance. Look, I've got to say this wasn't inappropriate. After all, my office was well across the complexities of the issues these families faced, and we did have a clear systemic view of the range of issues. But I'm going to note that there's no votes in this sort of work. We did it because it remains a huge human rights issue which needs to be addressed. And I remain deeply disappointed that I never got to see the desperately needed reform of the Criminal Law Mentally Impaired Accused Act. And on a related issue, I remain a huge supporter of the establishment of the Disability Justice Centre. I condemn those who ran fear campaigns against its establishment, and I want to be on the record saying that entirely the wrong people are currently running it. I've seen for myself the chasm in reporting between the clinical professionals working with the residents of the centre and the management reports which ultimately end up with the minister. And they are reports that are like chalk and cheese. So simply it's never going to succeed as intended until the right people are running the show. But I digress. I've been consistent in my call for an increase in funding of community-based mental health services, supporting people in the community before they get to crisis point, ensuring that we're funding our suicide prevention services and that they're also fit for purpose. And members know how much work I have done in this space, as does the sector. And I don't think it's any coincidence that after I lost my seat in 2013 that I was asked to be the President of the WA Association for Mental Health and the inaugural co-lead for the Department of Health statewide mental health network. I remind members that the 10-year Mental Health and Alcohol and Other Drugs Plan 2015-2025 was born out of that time. How devastating that the necessary investment in prevention, early intervention and community-based mental health services that was so carefully quantified has not been realised. The result being the crisis that we are now seeing in our hospitals and emergency departments, and it is completely foreseeable. How many lives have been unnecessarily lost in this time? Where's the desperately needed investment in our forensic mental health services as prescribed in the plan, or specialised services for identified population groups, such as the cold community, or specialised services for those living with personality disorders, or sufficient funding for eating disorders, or consultant liaison psychiatrists, or pretty much most of the plan? Being appointed to the Ministerial Council for Suicide Prevention was an enormous privilege, and amongst so many things enabled me to finally have established the Australian first suicide postvention program for children bereaved by suicide, based on the research that I was able to provide and that I'd carefully collated over 20 years. I note that independent evaluations of this service have proven it to be highly successful, and as I've said before in this place, it needs to be expanded. It currently has waiting lists. It needs to be available for regional West Australians. It needs to be tailored for Aboriginal communities and developed with those communities. Make sure it keeps getting funded, members. You'll be hearing from me if there are any attempts to downgrade this critical and life-saving service. I want to acknowledge those brave but heartbroken families that have reached out to me for support, whether it be desperately seeking help for loved ones in crisis or after the worst has happened, desperately seeking answers as to how their lives could have been irreversibly shattered through the suicide of someone who never should have died. People who've battled our health, our child protection and our education systems, returned veterans who never received the assistance they needed, and elderly people who have given up hope. I've also worked closely with families who have loved ones in prison, sometimes loved ones who've died in prison. I've called for reform of the Coroner's Court, and of course we need a massive overhaul of our prison system. Corrective services have no place trying to deliver health, mental health or AOD services, and I think it's a travesty that this government abandoned the Justice Health project that began under the previous government, as it was such necessary reform. But of course we need to address the social determinants that lead people to end up in our justice system in the first place. Social reinvestment is a real and demonstrated solution. Yes, I know it flies in the face of populist and cynical politics, but it does transform communities and individual lives, and it's the future approach to addressing offending behaviours that we need. One of the extraordinary experiences of having been in this role has been the exposure to so many people's complex lives and personal histories. Working with David Templeman, member for Mandurah, who coordinated the Assembly response, while I coordinated the Council response to formally apologise to those women who'd been subject to forced adoption, was one of the most powerful of my life. Working with people who tried to navigate the gutted redress scheme and the resultant fallout. Working with our forgotten Australians in their quest for justice and closure. In June of 2012, I formally called, through a motion on notice, for a royal commission into alleged abuse in state institutions, and I note at the time I was accused of overreacting, yet some months later the federal government finally called a royal commission of its own, and the rest is history. The early days of the call for the NDIS were powerful, and by my second term the issue had become whether to join the federal scheme or not, and then how successfully or otherwise the transition was occurring. I hadn't known, of course, just how personal that issue would become, and unfortunately as a parent who's had to navigate the system, I can personally testify as to how problematic it has become for so many people, despite being such a hard-fought-for reform. you could almost be left to believe that it's been deliberately set up to deny people the supports they so desperately need. I and my husband are both lawyers. I'm a Member of Parliament, the spokesperson for disability. I was involved in the early days of trying to ensure the appropriate incorporation of psychosocial disability into the system. I've been helping others for years to get outcomes with the NDIS. In short, it's hard to see someone, I believe, who would be better placed to navigate that system. Yet, despite having a child with a definitive diagnosis and a serious prognosis, I struggle to make sure my son got the supports that he needs. And if that's what it's like for me, members, I ask you, how must it be for everybody else? We've got to fix that. It's not good enough. And while we're at it, independent assessments need to be immediately abandoned. Homelessness has always remained chronically unaddressed, but never more so than now. I've taken a particular interest in addressing the social determinants that are more likely to lead to homelessness: mental health, disability, family and domestic violence. I'm devastated at the unhelpful role that child protection too often plays in the process. But at the end of the day, we need places for people to live. And the fact that there's less social housing than we had 4 years ago is a disgrace. Housing is a fundamental human right. The need for shelter is not optional. We must do better. Certainly, I've tried to play my part in shining a spotlight on the problem. I remain an ardent and passionate supporter for a fully funded and free education and training system. I know that for many people, private school can feel like the only option when faced with an underfunded and crowded public system. That, members, does not represent real choice. But it does mean that not all of our children are getting what they need. In particular, I note the needs of students at educational risk, particularly those with autism and students living with mental distress, whose needs are so often being left unmet. Having said that, I want to acknowledge the hard-working teachers who are doing their absolute best, and I do want to specifically note the School for Special Educational Needs censors who do such a terrific and caring job. I've also, over my 2 terms, continued to raise issues of animal welfare. If people think you have to choose between advocating for people or animals, then frankly, I think you simply lack ambition. And I've most certainly felt capable of doing both, whether it be calling for essential changes to our farming practices, such as banning sow stalls or ending live animal exports, or banning cruel so-called entertainment industries, such as greyhound racing. I'm happy to be at the forefront of calling for reforms for these sentient creatures. Again, this is an area that I've been very active in for a very long time, starting as a 15-year-old when I first got involved in the anti-vivisection movement, then considered a radical movement. Now it's completely mainstream. I'll never understand how people can turn a blind eye to, let alone perpetuate animal cruelty. Of course, underpinning my work throughout this whole time has been the need to address the existential threat that is climate change. It's always been the issue that's there. Now, when I first joined the Greens over 3 decades ago, it was referred to as global warming, and I endured years of being scoffed at and ridiculed, telling me that it wasn't real and just conspiracy thinking. Then in 2007, it apparently became the moral issue of our time. That was correct, by the way, and here we are now in 2021 where only the most foolish would deny its existence, and here we are still with no clear plan in Australia to fully address it. We see some progress, expansion of clean energies, albeit far too slowly, but we continue to knock down our forests, our carbon sinks at record rates, continuing to render entire species extinct, and our emissions continue to skyrocket as we point the finger at anyone other than ourselves to find the solutions. I'm really glad that at least I have been in a party that has never asked me to resile from the fight to address climate change. Indeed, it was only a few years ago that my children came to me to thank me for the work the Greens have done to try to address climate change. Now, I hadn't realised that they hadn't realised that their mum was on the right side of history on this. It turns out that they'd had no idea what I did for a job. And whilst it's personally gratifying to have my work appreciated by my kids, I am devastated I couldn't do more to safeguard their futures. So I think this is something that the community is now going to take up, and believe me, I think they will. Because corporate Australia can't run the show forever, and I'm pleased at the work I did in calling for electoral donations reform. My office did so much work trying to chase the dollars, the discrepancies between state and federal reporting regimes, thresholds that enable monies to be hidden, third-party donations, the use of shelf companies to obfuscate trails of donations. It's all there and it's worthy of CCC level investigation, but I won't be holding my breath that that will be a priority. So the call for the banning of corporate donations will continue. Fossil fuel and mining interests already enjoy disproportionately too much power in this state, as does the gambling industry, as do developers. At a minimum, we need to follow the lead of other states and ban developer donations. They can do it, we can do it too. And when I think of the sort of electoral work as opposed to portfolio work, which dominated so much of my time in terms of representing the community, I note at times there was significant overlap. Now, the Greens support well-planned density in our suburbs, density which respects green spaces and existing mature trees, heritage and people's sense of community. We believe it's possible for density to be done well and done in ways that not only ensure that everyone has a place to live, but that people can age in place and communities can flourish. But with increasing regularity, we see development applications being approved that are wildly out of kilter with this good planning. And I note that the new COVID planning laws seem to have exacerbated this flurry, as has the inexplicable and intractable position to be the only state that refuses to have third-party right of appeal laws in our planning system. Now, so much of my work during my 2 terms has been attempting to ensure the preservation of our bush forever sites. I've dealt not only with the Urban Bushland Council at a systemic level, but with numerous individual friends groups, those people that spend their weekends weeding and planting and preserving these precious ecosystems that remain on the Swan Coastal Plain. I want to thank those people for their tireless efforts. Finally, my work in this place has had a significant focus on the importance of maintaining the rule of law, the need for the separation of powers, access to justice and challenging the abuse of power. The rule of law, the separation of powers and procedural fairness is dangerously being increasingly treated as an obstacle to short-term, often politicised outcome rather than what it is, a cornerstone of our democratic system of government, a critical safeguard to address the potential tyranny of power. Mandatory sentencing is an abomination. Removing the capacity for judicial discretion is something which should be vehemently resisted. The possibility of receiving judgment without the capacity for justice should terrify everyone. People should always have the right to a fair trial, to have an impartial decision maker, the right to be heard, the right to know the allegations against them and to be able to respond. The punishment, if any, should be proportionate. Those who are not legally responsible for their actions through mental, cognitive or intellectual impairment or senility should be treated with their human rights upheld. Access to justice should not only be reserved for the wealthy. We need to fund legal aid and our community legal centres appropriately. We need to expand our diversionary courts. We need model litigant guidelines so that the state cannot inappropriately wield the extraordinary power and endless resources that it holds in order to crush the average citizen and deny them justice. We need to have structures that can speak to the abuse of extraordinary powers, ensuring the centuries-long tradition of the separation of powers must be vigorously upheld. Yet recent events have demonstrated how deeply under threat these safeguards are. We need to ensure that the CCC is subject to fearless and apolitical oversight, that centuries-old principles such as parliamentary privilege, which has ensured that individual citizens can take their concerns to the Parliament without fear of retribution, can be maintained. We need to ensure that our police are both supported when they're doing the right thing and oversighted and held to account when they're not. I have no interest in living in a state of fear. I want to live in a state where I know that when I do the right thing, when I behave honestly, and I do, that I will not be subject to the victimisation of the state, unfairly maligned, the subject of political retribution, denied justice and the right to a peaceful life and personal privacy. When our systems are devoid of the rule of law and the protections of procedural fairness and the separation of powers are dismantled, it's no longer possible to take comfort in the adage that as long as you don't do anything wrong, you'll have nothing to fear. I'm an honest citizen and I live my life with integrity. And I also maintain the right to undertake non-violent protest and to speak out against wrongdoing when I see it, a right that every citizen should have. I have the right to do that with so many fellow travellers by my side as we continue to call for the progressive change that's needed in this world to ensure our planet and its ecosystems are protected, that our governments are accountable and that those in our community who are the most vulnerable are protected and supported. And so, it's with enormous gratitude that I acknowledge and thank the thousands of Greens who've stood with me to achieve those exact outcomes. As I said, I joined the Greens in 1990, a very young woman, and in my time in the party, I've held many of the most senior roles, including being National Convener of the Australian Greens, State Co-Convener of the Greens WA, and run statewide election campaigns, all for free, all without expectation of payment, all for the cause. And I haven't been alone, with volunteers who've built the party and kept it running, building membership, fundraising, undertaking community campaigns, and of course the all-critical election activity. It is our culture of volunteerism which has been the backbone of our party, and I count so many Greens members as being amongst my dearest friends. I thank those Greens members who've put their names forward to assist me personally in the campaigns in East and then North Metro, and who've put their lives on hold completely unpaid. In terms of the most recent election, I want to thank those who put themselves out there publicly. Benedict, Louis, Elizabeth, Nicholas, Mark, Teresa, Katrina, Greg, Angelo, Isabella, Tamara, Francesca, SP, Matt, Daniel and Sarah as part of Team North Metro. And an enormous thank you for the tireless efforts of Laurel and Steve, who never rested even when they were stuck in quarantine. You all put your lives on hold and you worked your butts off for nothing more than your belief in the party and the hope that we would retain North Metro. I thank the literally hundreds, if not thousands, of members who've handed out how to votes, including on the interminable pre-poll, leafleted, door-knocked, phone-banked, organised forums and staff stalls. We're so lucky to be such a large party of volunteers. To be clear, a broken electoral system may have denied us our rightful representation, but the party is as strong as ever. I want to acknowledge my colleagues, the Honourable Robin Chappell, the Honourable Tim Clifford and the Honourable Diane Evers. There are only 4 of us, but we well and truly punch above our weight. And I want to acknowledge the decades of inspiration and support that I've received from former Senator Joe Valentine, the practical support I received being inducted into this place by the Honourable Giz Watson, and the ongoing friendship and camaraderie I enjoy with my colleague, Senator Rachel Seward. Special thanks to my comrades, the Honourable Tammy Franks in South Australia and the Honourable David Shoebridge in New South Wales for always being there. Now, a shout out to my friend, Dr Brad Pettit, who will have the unenviable job of being the only Green representative in the 41st Parliament. And Brad and I have known each other since we both met as young activists in Friends v East Timor and back in 1993, and over the years continued to cross over in numerous campaigns and community groups. Members, Brad was even on the ticket as a support candidate in my successful tilt for Murdoch University Guild President over 2 decades ago. So I'm sorry that we won't get to be in the chamber together, Brad, but as you know, I'm always here to support you. Like so many others here, I want to pay tribute to my staff, the loyalty, friendship and sheer competence of which is beyond compare. I've been fortunate to have a number of wonderful staff over the years, noting in particular my current electoral staff of Kirsten, Jocasta, Piper and Aaron. But I also want to acknowledge Raveen, Tom and especially the lovely Lee for their work this term. An enormous thank you also to Tonya, my whips clerk, for her diligence and intelligence, who has kept the long and unfriendly hours of this place along with the parliamentary team, as well as having to track the daily shenanigans of the other place. But I particularly need to single out Kirsten and Jocasta, who first joined me on the May 22nd, 2009 as my electorate and research officers respectively. Not only are they 2 people whom I trust completely and totally, a special and so essential part of being able to do this role effectively, but I was honoured when, after having lost their jobs when I lost my seat in 2013, both left permanent employment to come back and work with me again when I was re-elected to Parliament in 2017. Jocasta left a permanent public sector job that she was extremely good at, and Kirsten, who'd moved to New South Wales and also had a permanent job in the public service, packed up and came back to WA to work with me again. I feel incredibly honoured to be the recipient of such loyalty, and from two of the finest and the most astute minds in the business, and words can't convey my gratitude to you both for the way you both supported and protected me. Thank you. My office has also had an enormous contribution from volunteers over the years. Numerous interns, people have come in to do the hard yards, undertaking forensic research into things like donations and mining licences, but a special acknowledgement of the stalwart of our volunteer team, Margot Bealby, who many of you will know, who even this week, just as she did from the very beginning of the 38th Parliament, continues to volunteer in my office. Thank you, Marbo. And yes, I mean Marbo. Anyway. Madam President, I want to acknowledge the courage and the integrity that you have demonstrated as the President of this chamber and the deep respect I hold you in. Very simply, you are an excellent President, and history will treat you kindly. Thank you for the outstanding job you've undertaken in the face of extraordinarily difficult and trying circumstances. Thank you to the clerk, Nigel Pratt, and the rest of the team in the chamber for valiantly trying to uphold the important traditions of this place, and for all your support. These traditions were originally designed to ensure members of Parliament could best represent their constituencies, and you have been tireless in trying to ensure they are upheld. Thank you to Hansard, who have had their work cut out for them in terms of the sheer volume of contributions I have made in this place. No regrets. Thank you to all the parliamentary staff who do such a superb job, and a particular shout out to Rob Hunter and Tony Patterson. Thank you to the committee staff who, frankly, we know are always the smartest people in the room. I want to thank those of you here from across the chamber and the political divide whom I count as friends. Not all of you, I might add, but certainly many of you. Although we may come to this place with different worldviews, aspirations and experiences, I've been grateful for the considered and the thoughtful way in which so many of you have been prepared to engage in genuine debate, to give me a hearing and to allow me to change your mind on a matter, and vice versa. Such has been the strength of this chamber to date. I thank those of you who have assisted me through some challenging times and empathised with me when I've shared some of my personal sadnesses. Most of us work long hours, we're away from our loved ones. It makes a difference when you work alongside people you respect, even when we may disagree. I want to thank my dearest of friends, Ali, Taryn and Ramona, and those friends that help keep it real, Amanda, Sarah and Heather. I want to thank the Social Justice Church crew, Jeff, Alex, Mark, Nathaniel, Kate, Reuben and Daniel. I'm eternally grateful for the ongoing love and support I receive from my many friends in the Uniting Church, and specifically the Uniting Church in the City congregation. I've always been deeply respectful of the Greens as a secular organisation, as I also respect the Parliament as a secular institution. But my personal faith and the support I receive from my church has been a significant source of my personal strength and the conviction to do my work. Care for creation, challenging corrupt and abusive power structures, caring for those who are deemed lesser, who are marginalised and othered is important lifelong work to which I am committed until the day I die. Thanks to my mum, Uncle Brian and Auntie Nada for all your love. And I want to thank my gorgeous children. As members of Parliament, we do long hours and we work every day. We have evening and weekend functions. Breakfast meetings suck and I try to avoid them, but sometimes we have to do them as well. We're public figures and this can impact on our children. But my gorgeous daughter Miette and my beautiful sons Jackson and Blake are the absolute lights of my lives. It hasn't been easy juggling motherhood and this job, but they've adapted to the demands amazingly. Blake, my youngest, was only 3 when I first got elected. All 3 have only ever known me being politically active in one way or another, their whole lives. They're fine human beings and I'm so proud of them. Finally, the most enormous thank you, the biggest thank you, goes to my husband Luke Edmonds, who's always by my side and has my back, full of advice, most of it good, and both emotionally as well as very practically supportive. This is a difficult job to do when you have kids if you don't have a supportive partner. Luke has been politically active by my side since we first met in student politics. a true fellow traveller in progressive politics, and my best friend in the whole wide world. Luke, I love you with all my heart, and it must be true because I'm saying it in Parliament and I'm not allowed to mislead the chamber. So thank you everyone for what has been an extraordinary experience. I have no intention of coming back, but hopefully I made the most of it while I was here. And I hope that the world is just that little bit better for my contribution. Thank you.
We'll just let the applause die down. The Honourable Alison Xamon, I'm sure on behalf of all the Chamber, we wish you and Luke and your children a wonderful time ahead of you. You have certainly contributed to this Chamber, and we will miss your evening regular members' statements, and we look forward to finding out who's going to step up to the plate to replace you for that activity. So good luck to you and thank you very much. Members.